Well, it's nice to have you come visit me. I don't get many visitors these days. Life's not that exciting. But back in the day, life was exciting for me. I'm Cyrus Eastman, Colonel Cyrus Eastman. And later on, I'll tell you how the Colonel came to be. As you can see, I was born March 15, 1814. But I was not born in Littleton. I was born in Danville, Vermont. My father was Jonathan. He was a carpenter by trade. I worked with my father. I can't tell you when I started working for him. I was so young. I loved going to work with my father, using the tools, and the way he worked with people. My father taught me not only good business skills, but he taught me good people skills. And these skills lasted me all of my life. I worked for him until I was 19 years old. Then I went to work for Fairbanks, Weights and Scales. And I was a salesman. And you know something? I found out I was a really good salesman. So I decided I should open up a place of my own. Found a gentleman by the name of Mr. Colby. He also wanted to open up a store. So we opened up Colby and Eastman, located right on Main Street we were. Now we did a great business. We were a mercantile business. We sold just about everything. Feed, hay, whatever you needed, we would sell it. And we did very well. We prospered. In fact, my net for an average year was $150,000. Okay, not bad for 1934, 1935, 1834, 1835. Yep. Well, I worked with him. Then along came some other businessmen, and they said, you know, the up-and-coming thing is the trains. And surely they were right. We actually had a train stop right here in Littleton, once a day. So, being the enterprising man that I was, I said, Cyrus, you need to build another store. And where did I want to build it? At the depot. So I did. But I remembered what my father taught me. He said, make sure you treat people right. So when the wagons would come to pick up the people and the merchandise off the trains, I made sure every horse was given free feed, free oats. And the drivers, they all got a free lunch and a ration of rum. Not much, though. We didn't want any DWIs even back then, thank you very much. The horses were tough. And that got me the respect and admiration of many people around here. And my business grew and prospered. And so I decided I was going to buy into this new hotel being built called the Crawford House in a place called the Crawford Notch. It was supposed to be a beautiful hotel, and I bought into it with a few friends. Well, it sounded like a good idea at the time. There was only one little problem. Before it even opened up, burned to the ground. Now the other investors, they said, we gotta wait a year or two. There's not enough time to rebuild. I said, no. I'm an enterprising young man. I can take care of this. I guarantee you, I can build and open the Crawford House in 60 days. Well, they kind of laughed at me, but I had the money, so they didn't laugh too hard. I said, I can do it, and by golly, I did. It wasn't easy, though, because remember, the only train that came in was to Littleton. So when the trains came in with all the lumber and everything we needed, we had to transport them all by horse and oxen. We had a lot of workers. I had 150 workers building. Guess what happened? 58 days, I opened the Crawford House. We served 40 people for dinner that night, and we entertained 100 people that evening. And the Crawford House was just wonderful. I absolutely loved it. So the Depot store was working just fine. Crawford House did just fine. I said, I need to do something for Littleton. So I decided to build an inn. And we call it the Cheswick Inn. Now I believe you people today know that where the community pool is, that's where I built the Cheswick Inn. It was the summer cottages for people to come up and visit. And I decided that's what I wanted to do for Littleton, because this was my town, and I loved Littleton. Enjoyed it immensely. So, as I grew older, a couple of things happened. Well, once, going back a little bit in time, it was 1842, and I formed one of the early militias. It was called the Littleton Greys. And because I was one of the first ones to form it, I got moved up in the ranks rather quickly, and they made me a colonel. Thus I became Colonel Cyrus Eastman. A couple of people I want to introduce you to, by the way. My beloved first wife, Susan French Tilton. Loved her dearly. She gave me 3 of the most beautiful daughters you ever want to see. Lucia, Martha, and Laura. Loved each one of them dearly. Was fortunate enough that Martha gave me a granddaughter, Susan Kenny. I loved them all. Sadly, my beloved wife died, quite a few years before me. Of course, I don't want to be telling tales or anything, but she was older than me by a year. And so I did decide that I would remarry, and I married a wonderful woman by the name of Julia Brackett. Loved her dearly too. Later on in the years, I became a representative for Littleton for 2 years. I was in the state legislature, Governor Goodwin's council. I was the head of several banks. I helped form other businesses in town. And I lived here for the rest of my life. And I will tell you right now, there was no finer town that I wanted to live in than Littleton, New Hampshire. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate you being here. If you have any questions, I'll do my best, but I'm old.
Why did you? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you came to visit me. My name is Warren Lovejoy. I've been a lifelong resident of Littleton, and I was born in 1844 on June 7th, sort of just up the street on Far Hill Road. And as a matter of fact, the house I was born in still stands. And you can see I just have never made it very far. This is as far as I've ever gotten. Well, being born on the farm, there was not much to life except for my 5 brothers, 3 sisters, school, and church. And I've been a lifelong Congregationalist. I listened to the sermons of Pastor Carpenter as he taught about peaceful harmony and to walk away from worldly spirits. In 1856, when Pastor Carpenter left, Jonathan Franklin Tilton took over as interim pastor, and he read sermons, the spiritual things that were written and published by Spurgeon and also Beecher. And it was because of those sermons that I had heard as a child in 1861, when the Southern Rebellion broke out. I joined the 1st New Hampshire Cavalry. I was the middle child and I didn't want to miss anything, so I wanted to get right out there right to begin with. I was 17 years old. And away I went. I got a mount, I saddled my horse, and I couldn't get out of Littleton fast enough. And we served the first year after the training in the 1861. We served the first year in a few of the skirmishes that happened around the Washington area. And then we were sort of put on hold in the early 1863, guarding the Capitol. The cavalry made a lot of sweeps just to keep the Rebs out. We didn't want them anywhere near the Capitol. Well, about the middle of June, after the 5th New Hampshire, led by Colonel Cross of Lancaster, had been almost totally decimated at Antietam and Fredericksburg in '62, and then in April in Chancellorsville, they were nearly wiped out. So they unmounted several of us and attached us to the 5th New Hampshire. And away we went, on foot, as an infantryman. We caught up with them during a forced march on the way to a little town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. And we arrived on July 1st in 1863. There was a little bit of skirmish going on and some of the battles had taken place, but we were camped for the night on top of the ridge. The next day we were put into the 3rd Regiment that was going to cover the area on the top of Cemetery Ridge, and we were put in reserve. We were under General Dan Sickles, and as I understand, General Dan Sickles was looking for medals, so he found a more favorable position for us. So we marched under and to the north of Little Round Top, and from there over toward the Devil's Den in early afternoon where a lot of the fighting was going on, and then we circled around to the top of a wheat field. We had to go through this marshy little pasture, and when we got to the top of the wheat field, we reorganized, and we were told to march through the wheat field. Halfway through the wheat field, the Rebs opened up on us. And the last thing that I remember hearing that day was Colonel Cross crying, "Close up, boys, okay." That was it. 2 days later, I woke up in a field hospital without a right arm. I was told that a mini ball had struck the upper part of my right arm. Several years later, in conversation with Dr. Childs from Bath, I was told that what was left of my arm, I really didn't want anyways. So that was okay. Well, several weeks later, I was back here in Littleton, back on the farm. And things were bound to get better. In 1866, I was at a social gathering at the Congregational Church, and I met this beautiful woman named Emelisa. She was a couple years my senior, but I fell in love. And on December 22nd, in 1868, we were married at the Congregational Church here in town. And with the help of Pastor Milliken's wife, Sarah, and Emelisa, and the Ladies' Society for Social and the Ladies' Social and Charitable Society, we had a grand wedding. It was wonderful. It was a great day. We acquired some property just up here on Far Hill Road and started a farm of our own, as well as building a house. Now, my brothers used to joke with me a lot about being a one-armed man building a house. I always told them that a one-armed man builds a house the same way as a two-armed man. It just takes him twice as long. So we kept on building and kept on farming, and it wasn't long until little Myrtie Bell came along. She was born on March 12, 1870. What a beautiful child she was. She was just the delight of my heart. And as if my joy couldn't get any fuller, 2 years later, on June 14th, 1872, Harry Amos came along, and we were delighted. But our joy soon turned to sadness, as on September 12th, Harry Amos passed away. And then, it was just 12 years later, in the spring, when little Myrtie Bell came down with a terrible cough. And the cough had turned into bronchitis, and she passed away on May 17th, 1864. 1884, I will get this right. It's been a while since I had to think of these things. I was 40 years old. I don't know whether you've been keeping track, but at that point I was 40 years old. I had lost an arm. I had lost a daughter. I had lost a son. I was starting to feel like Job. But as I was contemplating in that dark sort of mood that I was in, I remembered the sermons that I had heard, the stirring ones from Spurgeon and the ones from Beecher, and how they encouraged me years ago. And I was encouraged that at this point in my life, it was giving me opportunity to do some things. So I poured myself into the Congregational Church, into the GAR, and also into politics. I am a lifelong Republican, and still am, and will continue to be. And I'm not sure many of you have ever heard of the GAR, but it's called the Grand Army of the Republic. It was a service organization for Civil War veterans that lasted for many years. I was the commander of the Marshal Post of the GAR here in Littleton from 1891 until 1895. And we had learned to love it here in Littleton, and we stayed here and was just the most happy. I became a deacon of the Congregational Church, and it was the deacon's job to maintain the sacraments, to make sure that the needy were taken care of in the church, and to also make sure that the pastors was taken care of. The pastor actually called us his lookout committee, and we did. We took care of the pastor. We oversaw several of the construction jobs that had happened there. One of the highlights of my life, though, was in 1913, when the GAR had a large reunion at Gettysburg. For 15 days, hundreds of us gathered at Gettysburg. And we did the same thing that we had done 50 years earlier. We camped and we ate food cooked over open fires. And it was just a thrill to do that. And then coming back home, we continued to farm until late in the 1880, the 1919 or 1920, when we actually sold off the farm and moved back in with family. It's been quite a pleasure to have you all here to visit me today, and I hope you come back soon. Thank you very much.
Most places where you go, people have name tags. We do too. So if you would like to figure out who we are, look at our feet. Mine says 10 and a half. Well, welcome to our, I almost said welcome to our home. Well, yes, welcome to our home. I'm Dr. William Beatty. This is my wife, Elizabeth, and our daughter, Barbara. People may wonder how we have such a young daughter. Well, one of the things that you must know that on the other side, you come back any way you want. I had a choice of being me or an aardvark.
Okay. At age 9.
She came back at age 9. So we'll go ahead with our talk. Welcome and thank you for visiting us. It's such a large crowd. I thought that after all these years, after leaving this world in 1913, that people would not remember me. But it looks like either you didn't remember me or you're out for curiosity. So I'm Dr. William Beatty. I was born in Danville, Vermont, actually. And my father was a Presbyterian minister. So I really didn't have any, I didn't have any doctors on my side of the family. But you did, didn't you, dear?
My father was a doctor, Dr. Charles Tuttle.
So we kept it in. And also, Barbara, what did you do later?
I was a doctor for infants and children.
Say it again, please, Barbara.
Nice and loud.
I was a doctor for infants and children.
All right. So doctors kind of run in our family, either with the in-laws or through the blood. I was a surgeon, well-known surgeon, well-known doctor. I came to Littleton in 1890. We were married 1890.
90, yeah.
And
You came probably the year before.
I was 1889. She's better at dates than I am because actually I've been gone longer, so it takes me longer to bring things. So anyway, I was known as a skilled surgeon and as a doctor, and I just loved my work. Being a doctor was the most important thing in my life. I graduated from St. Johnsbury Academy. I also went to, I did my internship in education at Bellevue in New York City, and I was just known for my surgeon skill and my doctoring skills. I also was responsible for the starting of the Littleton Hospital. Before me, there was no hospital. And what had happened, it was through my friend John Glessner, who was from Chicago, and he and his family would vacation here. And what had happened is one of his help had an appendicitis attack, and I performed the surgery on the kitchen table. This kind of told Mr. Glessner that there was need for a hospital in the area. So he gave the seed money, $10,000 for the seed money to start the Littleton Hospital. And we built it up on Cottage Street. All right, and also up there was the nurses. We trained the nurses. I used to teach the nurses. So we had our own nurses, our own staff. It was really quite a thing. We became quite, quite a center for medicine. I always found that being educated and knowing more was very important. In the fall of 1912, I took a tour of Europe, and I met a Sir Otis at Oxford, and he gave me all the letters to get me into the right places in England. I studied, I went to Vienna, went to Berlin, Germany, where I performed many surgeries, and I met the man who came up with the turtle serum as a cure for tuberculosis. And he taught me how to create the serum. And I studied under him. Now, I performed so many surgeries in Berlin and Vienna, especially in Berlin, that the Germans started to call me Herr Doktor, which is quite an honor, because American medical schools weren't quite as good as European medical schools at the time. And when I came back to the United States, I brought this cure with me. And I met two fellows that I worked with in, goodness, was it Minnesota or Wisconsin? You don't remember either. That's good. At our age, we don't have to. But it was either Minnesota or Wisconsin. But so one of you may remember this. Their last names were Mayo. All right? And I worked with the original Mayo brothers. I became extremely well known around the United States. It was difficult having office hours living in Littleton because I also had patients in New York City. So when you're talking the early part of the 20th century, it took a while to get there. Took quite a while. Because of the cures, because of the work that I did with tuberculosis, I was elected, all right, which is kind of, it was a good thing, but it was a bad thing. I was elected 3 weeks before my death to the Doctors Club on Riverside Avenue in New York City. And this was most prestigious. They just didn't let any doctor in. You had to be the elite of the elite. Sounds like I'm bragging. I'm dead. I can't. All right? But the elite of the elite, the best doctors in the United States, belonged to this club. And I came from Littleton. Right? We lived on
Main Street.
Main Street.
Right where the post office is today.
They tore our house down. we had the two houses. We owned the house we lived in and the house next door, which was a tenement, which I rented out. And our neighbors were the Eastmans. Charles Eastman, he's not here today, but when you walk by, his stone is down there. Knock on it twice, he may answer. But Charles is down there, wonderful neighbor. Before I left for my European tour in the fall of 1912, I don't know either. Is that someone's horse? I'd hate to be around it when it lets go. But anyway, the Eastmans hosted a wonderful party for me the evening that I left on my tour. Anyone in the town of Ira Parker was there. He won't remember. Okay, but Ira was there. All right, but there were a number of people who were there at this party. As a matter of fact, the Heald girls were there. Their father, Judge Heald, was there, and Mary Heald actually served cake. I remember. She was just a little bit of. She was 13 years old, and Franny, I believe Franny was 9 or 10. You can meet them if you really want to walk. They're down there. All right. But anyway, they served the cake, and I remember the buggy came for me under the porte cochere and took me to the railroad station. And I went to Boston, or from Boston, I took another train to New York City, and then a steamer to Europe. London was my first stop. And I spent I think it was about 3 months touring. Now, I almost had a birthday. Well, I did have a birthday. My birthday is September 6th. So we're a little bit past it. The bad thing about it is that I died 3 weeks after my birthday. It was a real, quite a story on that. I just wasn't only the doctor at the hospital and had office hours on Union Street at our home. But I was the house doctor for the Mount Washington Hotel and for the Maplewood Hotel. And there was a Mr. Silly, C-I-L-L-Y, who was the manager of the Maplewood in Bethlehem. And Mr. Silly drove me in his automobile to the Crawford House, which if you talk to Cyrus Eastman, you know he rebuilt that after it burnt, but we're all connected in one way. We're all dead. But anyway, drove me to the Maplewood. And what had happened is I left out of the west entrance, not the Maplewood, excuse me, I left the Maplewood, went to the Crawford House, and I went out the side entrance under the porte cochere, and I noticed an automobile. Now, in 1913, it wasn't difficult to notice an automobile. It was like an elephant. They were huge, and they were still fairly new, and had those great big wheels. And what I did is I walked out in the road, and when I saw the automobile come around the corner, instead of stepping back, I thought I could make it. I kept on going. I didn't make it. I died instantly of a concussion, and the automobile ran over me. So it wasn't just knock me down. It was knock me down, then trample me. All right? If you'd like, I have tire marks. No.
Let me say a little bit, because we don't want to keep you too long.
That's right. I could talk a hungry. Go ahead.
But I just want to tell you what happened at the memorial service at our home. My husband was laid to rest in the parlor at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. By 10 o'clock that night, we still had guests stopping in. He was so well liked in the town. All the businesses closed on that day. Flowers came from everywhere. All the businesses sent flowers. The house was full of flowers. From the Maplewood, from the hospital, from the state of New Hampshire.
Governor Jordan.
Governor. It was unbelievable, the outpouring of love on that day in 1913. He was not even 50 years old when he passed, and it was very sad for all of us, but he would not have realized how many people showed up that day to pay their respects to him and how well loved he was. We always had a lot of parties at our house, and he was just very well loved.
We were
Just wanted to
very
let you know
hospitable.
that.
Very hospitable. Yes, but I went. The reason why I was at the Crawford House was to remove. There was a patient there, okay, and I was taking him. I was walking across the street to General and oh goodness, I can't remember their name. He was a general. Barron. General and Mrs. Barron had a cottage across the street, and we were going to move this patient to their house. Well, they ended up leaving the patient in the hotel and moving my body. Okay, and a friend of mine, a doctor, rushed right over to see if there was anything they could do to revive me. But death was instantaneous. And what I found interesting is I even have the newspaper from the Littleton Courier, the 1913 Courier. And I had a 4-page layout of it. So anyway, that's the Beatty family.
And he,
My name is Charles Parker. You can see my gravestone is the first one up front there, the brown one on my left here. This is one of the interment sites of my family, and actually we are buried in several places throughout the cemetery, and we actually have a relative who's actually not buried in this cemetery and today is walking among you.
Several relatives.
Judy.
And Stan, cousin Stan is here too.
Your cousin Stan.
Stanley.
Parker.
Yeah, Stanley.
Where's Stanley?
Son. So we have young Stan and elder Stan.
Just get Dick in front here.
Got a couple of chairs if you need to sit down.
Yeah. Okay, you're fine. You're fine.
Well, I'm here today. My name again is Charles Parker. I'm not here to talk about myself, though. I'm here to talk about my brother. My brother's not buried in this cemetery. He's actually buried down in Rhode Island, but he is one of the premier enterprising young men who started a company literally in a shoebox here in Littleton. But I get ahead of myself. My father came up from and lived in Sugar Hill. And of course, we kids would go to school back then in Lisbon because Lisbon and Sugar Hill were one and the same town. My father had a tannery. Anybody know what a tannery is? What's a tannery? Where you prepare hides in order to make them into other goods, especially gloves and such. My father, Silas, had a tannery. He bought it from a man down in Charlestown and brought it up into this area. And it turns out that my brother didn't chase the girls around in high school like all the rest of us were doing. Instead, he took this low-end product called leather, and he started making gloves. And in high school, he'd make the gloves, and then he would sell them. Now, people said you couldn't make gloves out of leather, out of deer skin back then because it's too hard to work with. So he didn't. He was actually making it out of sheepskin, but still, he'd make these gloves. He'd buy and tan it himself in a shoebox. So he literally started his company in a shoebox, and sold the gloves to make money. How many know what? Have you ever seen tanning? Do you know what this is? How about some of the young? We have the young ones here. Ladies, do you know what this is? You know what that is? Who knows what this is? It's a deer hide. It's a deer hide. Now, what would happen is that a hunter would go and shoot a deer, and then they would get the hide off, and I've done this by hand a couple of times, get all the innards out, and then you have the hide itself, but there's all this mucus stuff on the back, okay? So you have to put it up and hook it to a frame, and you take something sharp and you just drag it down until you get all that stuff, all this gooey stuff off the back. Well, once you're done, there's still what those smart people call these enzymes and stuff that are working there. And if you just left it, guess what would happen to the hide after a while?
It would rot.
It would rot and it'd be no good. So you'd have to put salt on it. And you'd let it kind of dry out after a while. But then what you'd wind up with is something that's not nearly as soft as this. It would be like cardboard. Okay? Now you got to soak it in something in order to bring the suppleness back to it. Well, the main thing, anybody know the main thing you used? You know what you'd use? The brain of the deer. No kidding. You take the brain of the deer and you'd mix it up with a few other additives and you'd treat the leather. Now actually there are several ways they used to do it. Believe it or not, you'd take dung and you'd work it with your feet, you know? And you'd kill all the enzymes. Yeah, it was quite a stinky business, and you always made sure you had that tannery on the edge of town, right? Yes, and then you also have to get all this fur off of it, don't you? Because you want something that looks like this when you're done. How do you think you get that off? Believe it or not, they use urine. So you had pea pots around town. I kid you not. And you use that to get the fur off. Well, that was tanning. So my father had a tannery. They did things a lot nicer back then as they moved along. But Silas, or my brother Ira, really was enamored by this business. And so when we graduated from high school, he went down to Ashland, just south of the Notch, down by Squam Lake, because there was a glove and mitten factory down there. Now, they were not making it out of deer hide. They were using other skins. And he learned all the ins and outs of the glove and mitten business. When he came back, on his 19th birthday, my father gave him his shares in the tannery. 63,600 shares. And do you know what he did with that, the proceeds from that? He went and bought hides and materials in order to tan and to stitch his own gloves. And for several years, he did everything from tanning the hides, to cutting it out, to stitching it together, to selling it and marketing it. But they were of such high quality that they sold themselves. He was very successful. Well, at about 9 years into this, a gentleman by the name of Charles T. Lincoln, he was a salesman from down in Boston in fine men's furnishings. And he came up here and he saw these gloves. Maybe a pair, not quite this fancy, but a really nice pair of gloves. And he looked at that and he said to Ira, you know, we can make a business out of this. If we can make enough of these, then I know someone down in Boston who could sell these. And they went into business. Charles and a man named Glazier, and he was a merchant down in Boston. He was going to be one of the first ones to sell these gloves. The three of them went into business. They started Ira Parker and Company. Each of these men invested about $2,000, and they started this company. Well, it took off. But what was happening is that it took a long time to make the gloves. And so the orders were building up and they weren't able to make them as fast as they'd like to. And good brother of mine, he heard of a patent by a man by the name of Moses Page down in Franklin, New Hampshire, had a patent on a new way to do tanning. He went down, smart enough, took his own money, bought this patent, exclusive rights to it, brought it back, and now he had a process, especially to get the fur off of the hide, leaving the grain of the hide, because what you'd usually do is you'd sandpaper it almost. You'd wind up with something more like suede. Suede's not very waterproof, is it? Most suedes. But if you leave the grain on it, it's strong, but it's soft, and it's almost water resistant. He bought this patent. It cut down the amount of time to do the tanning by more than half. He wound up with a quality that nobody could match. And off they went. They were making gloves and distributing them all over the Union, especially through this Charles Lincoln. He just knew how to do marketing. Well, after a while, after only about 3 years, the business grew so much that they moved into the old woolen mill. There used to be an old woolen mill down here on the river. If you walk down by the river, you see, okay? Well, there used to be a woolen mill that sat to the west of it. And that's where they started out in there. Actually, let me see if I got that. I always have to remember, because what happens is that there's several buildings that get built, okay? But they start off in the woolen mill, and they wind up having to build another one so they can do tanning in one place and make the gloves in the other. Well, unfortunately, the glove factory actually burnt down in about 1870, I think it was. Build a new one. Well, but this is November. This is the 10th of November. All the builders in the area said, we can't even start rebuilding until the spring. And Ira said, well, I can't have that. We've got all these orders to fill. Well, my brother steps up again. He goes and he contracts directly for the lumber. He directly contracts with several builders, and within 30 days, they rebuilt the building to make the gloves in. They were back in 30 days. In December, they're building this. 20 degrees below zero. One of the innovations was, if you go down there, there's a huge smokestack. They had to rebuild that. They had to find ways to keep the mortar warm so it wouldn't freeze as they're trying to build a smokestack, and it's still standing today. Absolutely amazing. That was my brother. Now, one thing that happens is that, as I said, we started out as the Ira Parker Company, but you know it as Saranac Glove. Now, Saranac actually was a trademark that we picked up on. Most of our pelts were coming from the Saranac Lake region of New York, which is just west of Lake Placid. And so we thought, well, that's a wonderful name. We'll use that as our trademark name. And we did that, and actually it means water running under a rock. So it went well also with where we were located down here on the Ammonoosuc River. It just worked out really well. Now it turns out that this was quite a business, and everyone wanted to get in on it, including myself. I decided I was going to start my own business making gloves in the area, as were about 4 other companies that did. I bought my leathers from my brother, his tanning, but I made them. But as you can well imagine, he was so far out ahead of us, in quality especially, but also in the wonderful marketing of Mr. Lincoln. And we all, pretty soon, we either went out of business or we sold out to Ira. And so we all came back into the same company. And it was at one point in the late 1800s, around 78, 80 something, where the Eureka Glove Company and the White Mountain Glove Company had consolidated, and then they decided to consolidate with us. And at that point, we became the Saranac Buck Glove Company. Okay? Where Buck is, everything was made from deer hide. All our products, mittens and gloves and all. We expanded into a new site, and when we merged and became Saranac Buck Glove, unfortunately Mr. Lincoln missed seeing that by 1 year. He was down in Rhode Island. He was fishing along the sea, cast out and slipped on the rock, and he drowned. So unfortunately, he never got to see the company that he started build grow into something so huge. Let's see. We sold to all the industry, especially the forestry. How many of you have a pair of gloves like this? These are my old gloves, you know, good work gloves. Sure.
I have ladies' gloves.
And the ladies' gloves. We also patented this buckle on here. Okay, no one else could have this nice buckle, so you could keep them on tight when you were out working or in the cold. We made mittens, leather mittens that were nicely lined, beautiful mittens. A woman by the name of Agnes was interviewed. She was 92, She'd worked for the glove company for 75 years. And then when we get done, you can come up and take a look, but she talks about, you know, working in the factory, and you'll see pictures here. Now what my brother did is put a screen down this center of the building so the women were on one side and men were on the other, because you didn't want them mixing. And not only that, but you couldn't talk. You couldn't talk. My brother was pretty sharp. Not only that, but you rented your sewing machine. Okay? You paid 3 cents a day to rent your sewing machine. And if you didn't take care of it, and if it needed work, you paid a workman 30 cents an hour in order to fix it, and the pay was deducted from your paycheck. Now we worked 10 hours a day, 5.5 days a week. They got an hour off for lunch. So you'd go for lunch, but you better be back by 1 o'clock, because my brother would lock the front door to the factory, and if you were late, you had to go around back, come in the back door, and there was a whistle there. You blew the whistle, so everybody knew you were late. So not only were you embarrassed, but you'd also, again, be deducted, and you know, your pay would be docked. And you didn't do that too many times before you were out of a job. We employed on the order of 275 people in town in 1900. The monthly payroll was $9,300, and you got paid 30 cents per dozen gloves or mittens that you made. We were selling each pair for as much as $4 a piece. The average was around $2. So think about that. In that year, we made 87,000 dozen pairs of gloves. That's an industry of almost $3 million, over $2 million, and our yearly payroll was $114,000.
Oh dear.
If you notice when you go through town, you'll go by Parker's Marketplace. That was my brother's house, a 20-room mansion. You can go and visit it, and the staircase is still there. You can see this beautiful staircase, and if you go downstairs and out back, I believe the fireplace is still there, someone had told me. Not only that, but with his money, my brother bought Parker Mountain up here. Okay? He was into real estate. He owned most of the primary real estate, or the prime real estate in the town. He ran a pipe from the factory down here on the river all the way up the mountain to put steam up there, because he built 2 300-foot greenhouses so he could raise cucumbers in the wintertime and sell them down in Boston. He also built an observatory up there, and if you had your little coupon and 10 cents, you could drive up the road, and that was a good place to see the White Mountains from, and you could see and visit the observatory. Pretty amazing. My brother was really something to start this company out of a shoebox. It tells you about how you have to spend money to make money, to invest, how to go out on a limb and put your whole self into it and really dedicate yourself to a company. And he did a lot for this town. He went and lived with his daughter, and is buried down in Rhode Island. So as you go around today, you can visit the tannery, which is down on Saranac Street. Today there's a salvage company there and a antique dealership. There's a wall there with some of the advertisements. You can see some of the gloves. And you can, of course, visit the marketplace, spend a little money while you're here in town, right? And don't forget to go down to the museum. Okay? Wonderful people down there. This is where most of these handouts have come from that you're welcome to come up and take a look at. Support the museum, because they're really working hard to keep the history alive in town. And so we give a thanks to them this afternoon for all the hard work they do. And some of them are among you too, volunteers and also supporters. If there's any questions, you can ask. Otherwise, come up and take a look at the things on the table here, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Did he marry and have children?
How lovely to see you out on this afternoon. Oh, my goodness. It's so nice to be out and about, as it were, isn't it? I think I've chosen a lovely day to make an appearance here. Oh, how very fortunate. I'd forgotten how lovely the leaves were and the hillsides. So I'm very much enjoying it. Hello, young lady. Shall I introduce myself, or are you introducing me?
You can introduce yourself once everybody gets here.
All right, I'll wait a little while then. You've got such a lovely group. Oh my. Oh. How is everyone today? Are you doing well? Are you enjoying your day today? Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, let me tell you my name. I am Adeline Wallace Chadbourne. Now, I was born in Littleton on April 20th, 1817. And I want to tell you a little bit of my life, and particularly my tasks and my jobs during the War of the Rebellion, the war between the states, the Civil War. Now, at the time that the war started, I was 44 years old. I was living in Chicago. I had married Major Benjamin Chadbourne. He was a Maine man, as it were. But we moved to Chicago, and therefore he joined the Illinois Regiment. Now, when the war broke out, I became very concerned with all of the soldiers and with how they were being provided with their uniforms and with clothing. And so one of the first things that I did was to organize a group of women that I knew were very good seamstresses. And I encouraged them and I worked with them, and we provided many uniforms and much clothing to the soldiers. We also tried to do other things to provide comfort for them. You know, the things that they didn't have often were the simple things, like stamps and paper and writing utensils to send things home. Well, that was a fun kind of job, working on the clothing and that sort of thing, and working with the other ladies to do this, but it wasn't a very exciting job. So I decided to become a nurse, and I was a nurse with the Army, and I worked in several of the field hospitals. In fact, I was asked by the Army to recruit more women to join the Army and actually be assigned to the various hospitals around the country. That was very interesting. The nursing that I did was very emotional, if you will, because some of the conditions in those hospitals were quite deplorable, really not very well run, and not for anyone's fault, but just because it was a field hospital and you couldn't have everything there that you needed. And some of the wounds and some of the illnesses were simply appalling. I soon found out that many of the soldiers would simply die. It was just inevitable. And it gradually dawned on me that they would be much better off if they were allowed to go home and be tended by those who loved and cared for them. So I made it my business to visit the various hospitals and to travel to Washington and really advocate for furloughs and discharges for the soldiers that I knew would be better off at home. And in doing this work, I became quite well known to all of the soldiers of all ranks, from the highest to the lowest. And also, because I was traveling to Washington a good deal, I became well known to those in power, as it were. Well, can you believe it? They asked me to be a spy for the Northern Army. Well, that was a job that was very interesting. They even equipped me with a gun. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Now, as it happened, I was possessed of quite a remarkable memory. It's faded a little since then, but I had a most remarkable memory. I also had a considerable amount of endurance and not a little audacity, qualities that stood me in good stead during this part of my life during the war. I was arrested several times, but because I carried all the information in my head, they had no proof, and they soon had to let me go. Now, one of the things that I was asked to do as a spy was to find out where was the cotton being shipped north coming from, since Southern cotton, it was illegal to ship Southern cotton north. It was illegal to buy Southern cotton, and yet a lot of Southern cotton found its way north, and a lot of people made a lot of money. So I was asked to find out who owns this cotton, and I made a few notes in my journal as I was going along with that, because no, it wasn't just the scalawags who were doing this, who were involved in this. Oh, no, no. One of the things I discovered was that William Sprague, a U.S. Senator and former governor of Rhode Island, was involved and had ties to a smuggling group who were shipping cotton north. Now, William Sprague married Kate Chase. Kate Chase was the daughter of Salmon Chase. He was a later Chief Justice of the United States. They were very well off. Well, they were better off, apparently, than they should have been. And there was a gentleman, well, I use the term loosely, there was a Vermont soldier named Jim Fisk. Now, Jim Fisk was an enterprising young man, and he apparently saw an opportunity to make money off from buying Southern cotton and shipping it north and selling it for a bit more money. It is said, well, actually, I was told in my role as a spy that Jim Fisk, in one day, bought $800,000 worth of Southern cotton in one day. Oh my, oh my. Well, he worked for Jordan and Marsh Company. I thought this was interesting, in Boston, Massachusetts. Jordan and Marsh Company was making very inferior quality clothing for the Union soldiers. But when they found out what Jim Fisk had done, they fired him. I thought that was only fair. I kept a letter that I had here. This was given to me, and I put it in my journal to keep. This is from Mr. Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War. And this was something that I treasured. Here is what the letter says. It's dated April 13th, 1862, from the War Department. Mrs. B.H. Chadbourne has permission to pass within the lines of the United States forces on the western waters for the purpose of giving care and attention to sick and wounded soldiers of the United States Army. All officers and persons in the service of the United States will offer her courtesy, protection, and assistance. And it's signed Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. I was very, very pleased to receive that. I wanted to tell you about my gun. Fortunately, in all of my time as a spy, I did not have to use that gun, but I did carry it with me. And as it turns out, there was one unfortunate day when the gun discharged accidentally, and I wounded myself. I suffered from that wound for the remainder of my life. I felt so foolish. Now, after the war, I petitioned for a pension, as many of us did. And I wanted to quote from you. I wrote this out in my journal, just a little bit of the letter from the Committee of Pensions. And here is what they said about me. She served faithfully throughout the war in her capacity as nurse, and until 3 months after its close, this is true. And for her invaluable service, the government has never paid her 1 farthing, also true. We regard her as one of the most meritorious cases presented to this committee. Mrs. Chadbourne produces high testimonials for her character and the value of her services from Schuyler, I can't remember his last name and my writing is terrible here, Mr. Arnold, F.W. Kellogg, Miss Dorothea Dix, you may remember her name, and others. And so I was eventually awarded a pension of $300 a year. Now, after the war, I still felt that I needed to do something for the more unfortunate people around me, and I decided that I would seek out and adopt children who needed a home. And so I was able to adopt several children. Now, I am not buried in this cemetery. I am buried in Dalton. You, I'm sure, know that town. My family had a home there. And after the war, I lived in Washington, but I would spend many summers there in Dalton. And upon my death at age 73, I asked to be buried there. So should you visit the lovely town of Dalton and the cemetery there, please look for my stone and say a bit of a prayer for my soul and for all of your souls. Thank you. Thank you
So good afternoon. Obviously they leave the best for last. My name is Henry Lowell Tilton, and my family resides here. This is my obelisk, and I was born in Danville, Vermont, May 3rd, 1828. I married Caroline Brackett, who was, we were married October 11th, 1855. So we have our wedding anniversary coming up soon. I think it will be our 154th. Probably should get some silver or gold or something for that. I'm sure she would be very proud that I remembered this date. She was the daughter of William Brackett, who built the Brackett Building on Main Street. It was the oldest. It's now the oldest existing building in Littleton, where the Northern Lights Music is now. I was a Episcopal, a member of the church located on School Street, in back of Parker's Marketplace. Politically, I was Republican, and I was my occupation primarily was banker. I was a businessman and investor and active in the community. And my wife and I, we had 2 children. Laura Isabel was born in 1858, after a few years after we got married, and my son George Henry in 1860. George Henry's back here. Actually, you'll see several George Henrys. It's a popular name among my prodigy. As a young man, as a young lad, I attended the Phillips Academy and actually taught school at age 19. When I turned 20, my father gave me a suit of clothes and sent me off to Littleton to work with my brother, who had a shop on Main Street called Eastman Tilton and Company, where I worked for 3 years for room and board and clothing, and I was grateful to have a job. After 3 years, I started to earn a salary. It was wonderful. But I had my sights set for something bigger. And about that time, I had read about this gold rush in California. So some friends of mine and I, four friends and I, we went out to California to find our fortune, and we landed in San Francisco. And at my first venture there, I sold pails of water for 10 cents. And I did quite well. Well enough that I took notice of a large hardware store, hired me as a salesman, where I continued to work for a salary of $200 a month. And I met some folks there who became business partners. Mills Cady, we started a business where we imported goods from New York and Boston, and we made some good money. And after 3.5 years, I decided to return back to Littleton. That was about 1852, and I became a partner in the same business that I had originally started in when I first came to Littleton years earlier. And I bought some property near town at High Street, Clay Street, Jackson Street, and bought the land and built some housing lots, developed the housing and financed the homes, and started getting into the sort of the loan banking business. Around 1861 was the onset of the Civil War. And I helped, as a selectman in town, I helped raise $30,000 as bonuses for men who would enlist in the Union Army. And as a result of that, Littleton met its quota for soldiers in the war. So I opened a first bank in Littleton, and we obtained our charter in 1868 after the war. And in 1870, we built the Tilton block, and where the bank was then located. And I continued to make loans and help fire the engine of entrepreneurship and small business in our community. But just a year later, my health started to fail at the ripe old age of 48. And I was advised to retire. So I took some time, and the bank became a national bank, not just a local one. But in a year and a half, I did regain my health. And shortly after that, my father passed away, and I was executor of his will and became quarter owner of the Howland Tilton Company, which made chairbacks. My mother also died, and I was executor of her will, and a couple years later, my daughter, at the tender age of 18, passed away. In 1879, I became involved with the Apthorpe Reservoir Company, furnishing water for that village. So I kind of went back to my roots of selling water, only this time it wasn't by the bucket. In 1881, we built the Tilton Opera Block at a cost of $50,000. And it was all brick and granite. Very proud of that, and they made me president of the company and the Tilton stock holdings. And some of my friends from out west that I maintain a relationship with moved up to Spokane, Washington, and asked that I invest in some ventures in real estate there. And actually, I really built my fortune in real estate through the Tilton Loan Company. So through my years, I was involved in civic activities. I was a state representative. I was on Governor Straw's staff, an advisor. I was on the Board of Education, the Littleton Music Association, vice president of National Bank and Savings Banks. As a matter of fact, and I was somewhat involved in politics. In the 1880, I was part of the Chicago nominating convention. We were nominated James Garfield. And so I lived till the age of 79. Died in 1909. and very proud of family that followed me. Thank you all for coming.